My daughter-in-law is trying to convince my son to throw me out of my own house, so I made them both homeless. My daughter-in-law Chloe moved into my house with my son Ryan after they got married, claiming it would just be for a few months while they saved for their own place. That was 3 years ago, and instead of saving money, Chloe had been working on her real project, which was convincing Ryan that I was too old to live alone and needed to be put in a nursing home so they could have my house. She started small by pointing out every time I forgot something. Did your mom already tell you about the dentist appointment? Oh, she must have forgotten, poor thing. She'd move my keys and then act concerned when I couldn't find them. Getting older is so hard, isn't it? Maybe we should look into those assisted living places just to have options. She'd tell Ryan she was worried about me living alone in such a big house, even though I was only 62 and in perfect health. Chloe would cook elaborate meals, then tell Ryan I couldn't handle kitchen tasks anymore because I'd left one pan in the sink. She'd invite her friends over and introduce me as Ryan's elderly mother who needed constant supervision. When I'd correct her, she'd pat my hand and whisper to them that denial was a normal part of cognitive decline. She convinced Ryan to install cameras in the common areas for my safety, but really she was building a case that I was incompetent. She'd review footage looking for anything she could twist. Look, your mom stood at the refrigerator for 5 minutes yesterday. That's not normal, Ryan. She might be having episodes. If I took a nap, she'd document it as excessive sleeping indicating depression or illness. If I stayed up late reading, she'd say irregular sleep patterns were a sign of dementia. Ryan started believing her because Chloe was relentless. She'd wake him up at night claiming she heard me wandering around confused when I was just getting water. She'd point out that I was wearing the same shirt 2 days in a row when she'd hidden my laundry. She created these situations, then used them as evidence that I was declining rapidly. The breaking point came when Chloe scheduled a family meeting with Ryan's aunts and uncles to discuss my future care. She'd created a whole presentation about why I needed immediate intervention. She had photos of the house looking messy because she'd staged them when I wasn't home. She had a list of supposed incidents that were either completely fabricated or wildly exaggerated. She even had brochures for memory care facilities that she'd already visited. I sat there listening to my son explain how Chloe had opened his eyes to my deterioration and how they needed to take action before something terrible happened. My own sister started crying, saying she hadn't realized things were so bad. My brother asked if I'd been officially diagnosed with anything. Ryan said not yet, but Chloe had been documenting everything for when they needed to petition for guardianship. That word guardianship made everything crystal clear. I stood up and said, "This meeting is over, everyone please leave except Ryan and Chloe." After everyone left, I went to my office and came back with a folder. I said, "Chloe, since you're so concerned about documentation, I have some of my own." I pulled out printed screenshots from the security cameras she'd insisted on installing. Here's you taking my blood pressure medication and hiding it in your room. Here's you putting dish soap in my coffee maker, then filming me confused about why it's not working. Here's you setting my alarm clock for 3 a.m., then recording me being disoriented when it went off. Chloe tried to interrupt, but I kept going. Here's the receipt for the storage unit where you've been taking my belongings, then telling Ryan I'm losing things. Here's the recording from my phone of you on the patio, telling your sister that you just need me declared incompetent, then the house is yours, free and clear. Here's you Googling how to fake dementia symptoms in the elderly and power of attorney requirements. Ryan's face went from confused to horrified as I laid out 3 years of evidence. But the best part, Chloe, is this house isn't even mine to lose. I pulled out the deed. It's in a trust, and I'm just the trustee. The beneficiary is my nephew Ethan because Ryan already got his inheritance when I paid for his college and gave him $50,000 for your wedding. This house was never going to be yours no matter how many nursing homes you tried to put me in. Chloe started screaming that I was lying, that Ryan deserved the house, that I was a selfish witch who was probably leaving everything to charity out of spite. Ryan tried to defend her, saying she was just concerned about my well-being, but I pulled out my medical records. Here's my physical from last month. Perfect blood work, perfect cognitive exam, perfect everything. Your wife has been poisoning you against me while literally poisoning me. I showed him the toxicology report I'd gotten after suspecting she was drugging me. Ryan sat frozen on the couch staring at the toxicology report in his hands. His face went completely white as he read the results showing traces of sleeping medication in my system, even though I'd never been prescribed anything like that. Chloe started screaming that I was lying and had made everything up to turn Ryan against her. She said I probably paid someone to fake all the documents and footage because I never wanted her in this family. I stayed calm and reached back into my folder. I pulled out the storage unit rental agreement with Chloe's signature right there at the bottom next to the date from 26 months ago. Then I showed Ryan the security footage from the storage facility showing Chloe making trip after trip with boxes and bags from our house. You could see her loading my grandmother's china set, my photo albums, even my winter coats into her car across multiple visits over 2 years. Chloe lunged across the coffee table trying to grab the papers out of my hands. Ryan finally moved and caught her wrist before she could reach them. His voice cracked when he asked me if everything I was showing him was really true. I watched my son's face as the truth hit him all at once. He'd been manipulated into thinking his own mother was losing her mind when really his wife had been running a 3-year con to steal my house. I handed Ryan my phone and pulled up the footage of Chloe in their bedroom. The timestamp showed her taking my blood pressure medication from her purse and hiding the bottle in her makeup drawer. Ryan went completely pale watching the screen. He asked how long I'd known about all of this. I told him I started getting suspicious about 6 months ago, when I found my blood pressure pills mixed in with Chloe's makeup. That's when I started paying closer attention to things that didn't add up. Chloe switched her approach immediately and started crying. She said she was only trying to help because she was really worried about me. The tears looked real, but I'd seen her practice this exact performance in the bathroom mirror. Ryan stared at her like he was looking at a complete stranger. He asked about the phone conversation I'd mentioned earlier where Chloe told her sister about getting the house. I pulled up the recording on my phone and hit play. Chloe's voice came through crystal clear, talking to her sister on the patio. She said all they needed was to get me declared unable to take care of myself, and then the house would be theirs free and clear. Her sister asked what would happen to me, and Chloe laughed, saying there were plenty of cheap nursing homes that would take someone on Medicare. I watched Chloe's face change from fake tears to pure rage as the recording played. She called me a mean witch and said Ryan deserved this house after everything he'd done for me. I reminded her about the $50,000 I gave them for their wedding, and the 4 years of college tuition I paid for Ryan. Chloe ignored that completely and kept yelling about how unfair I was being. Ryan stood up from the couch and asked Chloe how many times she'd lied to him about me being confused or losing things. His voice was shaking, but he kept going. He asked how many times she'd told him I was having memory problems when really she was hiding my stuff. Chloe tried to touch his arm, but Ryan pulled away from her. And I could see 3 years of lies starting to break apart in his head as he put the pieces together. I looked at both of them and said they had 1 week to find somewhere else to live. Chloe immediately started threatening to sue me for elder abuse and illegal eviction. She said she'd call the police and tell them I was trying to throw out my own family. I reminded her very calmly that I had a lawyer and 3 years of documented proof of her actual abuse. I had video evidence of her tampering with my medication, which was a crime. I had recordings of her planning to steal my house. I had receipts showing she'd been hiding my belongings and lying about it. Chloe's face turned red, but she didn't have anything to say to that. Ryan asked if he could talk to me alone. Chloe started to argue, but Ryan told her to go upstairs. She stormed out of the room, and we heard her stomping up the stairs and slamming the bedroom door. As soon as she was gone, Ryan completely broke down crying. He put his head in his hands and his whole body shook. He said he couldn't believe he'd let this happen to me. He asked how I could ever forgive him for not seeing what was right in front of him for 3 whole years. I sat down next to him on the couch and put my hand on his shoulder. I told him that Chloe was a really skilled manipulator who'd used his love for me as a weapon against both of us. She'd taken his natural concern for his mother and twisted it into something ugly. Ryan admitted that he'd started noticing things didn't make sense about 6 months ago. He said sometimes Chloe's stories about my behavior didn't match what he actually saw, but every time he questioned her, she had an explanation that made him doubt what he'd witnessed himself. That's exactly how manipulation works, and Chloe was an expert at it. We ended up talking for 2 solid hours, going through specific incidents one by one. I showed Ryan the footage of Chloe setting my alarm clock for 3 in the morning, then filming me when I woke up confused. I showed him video of her moving my car keys to different places, then acting concerned when I couldn't find them. I showed him the list I'd made of every time she'd hidden my laundry, then told him I was wearing dirty clothes. Ryan looked sick as he realized how many times he'd believed her lies over his own observations. He kept saying he should have known better and should have protected me. I told him that Chloe had been working on this plan since the day they moved in, and she'd been very careful about how she built her case against me. She'd isolated him from other family members by making him think he was the only one who understood how bad my condition was. She'd made him feel like a good son for wanting to protect me even while she was actually abusing me. Ryan asked to see the medication tampering footage again. We watched it together, and I could see him getting angry as he understood what she'd really been doing. This wasn't concern or care. This was deliberate harm designed to make me actually sick, so her lies would become true. Ryan sat there staring at the footage for another 10 minutes before he finally spoke. He asked if I would let him stay in the house while he figured out what to do about his marriage and his life. He said he needed time to process everything and didn't know where else to go. I told him yes, but only if Chloe left immediately, and he started seeing a therapist who could help him understand how she manipulated him for 3 years. Ryan nodded and said he'd make an appointment the next day. He went upstairs to tell Chloe she had to leave, and I heard them arguing through the ceiling. Her voice got louder and louder until she was screaming that this was her home too, and she had rights. Ryan came back downstairs an hour later looking exhausted, and said Chloe refused to go anywhere. She told him I was lying about everything, and if he believed me over her, then their marriage was over. He said maybe it should be over after what he'd seen tonight. I told Ryan to get some sleep and we'd deal with Chloe in the morning. I barely slept that night knowing she was still in my house after everything she'd done. The next morning, I called my attorney Harvey Dillon at 8 o'clock. I'd known Harvey for 20 years since he helped me set up the trust after my husband died. I explained the whole situation, and Harvey said he'd come right over with the paperwork we needed. He arrived within an hour carrying his briefcase and looking very serious. I showed him into my office and laid out all the evidence again. Harvey went through every piece carefully, watching the security footage, reading the toxicology report, examining the storage unit receipts. He said I had an airtight case for a restraining order based on the medication tampering alone. That was assault, and possibly attempted poisoning depending on what the prosecutor thought. Harvey recommended we file a police report immediately for the theft of my belongings and pursue charges for elder abuse and fraud. He pulled out a formal eviction notice he'd already prepared and a restraining order application. I signed everything while Harvey explained that Chloe had to be legally notified before we could proceed. Harvey walked upstairs with me and knocked on the bedroom door where Chloe had locked herself in. She didn't answer at first, but Harvey knocked again and announced he was an attorney serving legal notice. The door stayed closed, but we heard movement inside. Harvey knocked a third time and said Chloe needed to open the door, or he'd leave the papers outside and consider her served. Suddenly the door opened and Chloe stood there with her phone pointed at us recording video. She said we were harassing her and she had proof. Harvey smiled and calmly explained he was serving her with an eviction notice, and that her recording actually helped document proper legal procedure. He handed her the papers and she threw them on the floor. Harvey picked them up and placed them on the dresser inside the room. He told Chloe she had 72 hours to vacate the premises, and any attempt to stay beyond that would result in law enforcement involvement. Chloe started yelling that this was illegal, and she was calling her lawyer. Harvey gave her his business card and said he looked forward to hearing from her attorney. Chloe finally came downstairs an hour later after Harvey left. She walked right up to Ryan, who was sitting at the kitchen table, and grabbed his hands. She said his mother had turned him against her with lies and manipulation. She said I was a bitter old woman who couldn't stand to see them happy. Ryan pulled his hands away and told her to stop. He said he'd seen the evidence with his own eyes and watched her on video tampering with my medication. Chloe said the videos were edited and taken out of context. Ryan stood up and his voice came out flat and tired. He told her he needed her to stop lying because he couldn't take it anymore. Chloe started crying and said she was trying to protect me, and Ryan was choosing his mother over his wife. Ryan walked out of the kitchen without saying anything else. I went to my office and called the police non-emergency line. I told them I needed to report a theft and had documentation including security footage and rental agreements. The dispatcher said she'd send 2 officers over to take my statement. They arrived 30 minutes later and I showed them into the living room. I explained how Chloe had been taking my belongings to a storage unit for over 2 years, while telling my son I was losing things due to memory problems. I showed them the security camera footage of Chloe loading boxes into her car. I showed them the storage unit rental agreement with her signature. I showed them my list of missing items with descriptions and estimated values. The officers took notes and asked if Chloe was still in the house. I said yes, and they asked to speak with her. Ryan went upstairs to get Chloe, and she came down already crying. She immediately started talking about how I was a vindictive mother-in-law who never accepted her into the family. She said she'd been trying to help an elderly woman in decline, but I was too proud to admit I needed assistance. One of the officers held up his hand and asked her to explain the storage unit footage. Chloe said she was just storing things I didn't need anymore to make room in the house. The officer asked if she had my permission to take those items. Chloe hesitated and said she thought she was helping. The officer asked again if I'd given explicit permission, and Chloe said no, but she was family, and was doing what was best for me. I pulled out the folder of photos I'd taken at the storage unit. I showed the officers pictures of my grandmother's jewelry, important legal documents, family photo albums, expensive artwork. I explained these were items Chloe had told Ryan I'd lost or misplaced when she'd actually stolen them and hidden them away. The officers looked at each photo carefully. One of them asked Chloe if she understood these items had significant monetary and sentimental value. Chloe said she was keeping them safe because I wasn't capable of managing my own belongings anymore. The officer informed her that taking someone's property without permission, regardless of the reason, was theft. He said she needed to return everything immediately, or she'd be facing criminal charges. Chloe's face went red and she said this was ridiculous. Ryan's phone rang and he looked at the screen, then put it on speaker. Chloe's parents were calling. Her father's voice came through angry and demanding. He said they'd heard what we were doing to their daughter and wanted to know why we were persecuting someone who was only trying to help an elderly woman. Chloe's mother said in the background that this was elder abuse against Chloe, and they were going to get their own lawyer. Ryan's voice came out quiet but firm. He told them they should come over and see the evidence for themselves before they made accusations. There was silence on the phone, and then Chloe's father said they'd be there in an hour. When Chloe's parents arrived, I was ready. I'd organized all the evidence on the dining room table in clear sequence. The security footage was queued up on my laptop. The medical records and toxicology reports were in one folder. The storage unit documentation was in another. Photos of the stolen items were spread out. I walked them through everything exactly like I'd done with Ryan the night before. I showed them the video of Chloe hiding my medication. I showed them the footage of her setting my alarm clock for 3 a.m. I showed them the recording of her telling her sister the house would be theirs once I was declared incompetent. I showed them my recent medical exam proving I was in perfect health. I showed them the toxicology report indicating I'd been drugged. Chloe's father started to defend her, but Chloe's mother put her hand on his arm. She was watching the medication tampering video again, and her face had gone pale. She asked Chloe directly if she really did this. Chloe opened her mouth, but nothing came out. The silence told them everything they needed to know. Chloe's father stepped forward and put his hand on her shoulder. He started saying something about how we were all misunderstanding the situation, and Chloe had only been trying to help an elderly woman who clearly needed support. I watched Chloe's mother rewind the medication video again on my laptop, and her face went from pale to completely white. She stood up and walked over to Chloe and asked her again in a quiet voice if she really took my blood pressure pills and hid them in her room. Chloe opened her mouth, but nothing came out, and then she looked down at the floor. Her mother's hand went to her mouth and she started crying. She turned to me and apologized through tears, saying they had absolutely no idea their daughter was capable of something like this. Her father stopped mid-sentence and looked at his wife, then back at the laptop screen showing Chloe tampering with my medication bottle. His face changed from defensive to completely devastated, like someone had punched him in the stomach. He told Chloe she needed to leave my house right now and they would help her find an apartment, but she couldn't stay here another night. Chloe started screaming that I had manipulated the videos, and they were believing lies over their own daughter. Her mother just shook her head and said the timestamps were right there, and Chloe's own face was clear in every single frame. Ryan sat on the couch looking like he might throw up and didn't say a word while Chloe's parents basically dragged her out of the dining room. I heard them arguing in the driveway for almost 20 minutes before their car finally drove away. The next 2 days were a blur of Chloe packing her stuff while Harvey stood in the doorway of their bedroom, making sure she only took things that belonged to her. She shot me looks of pure hatred every time she walked past carrying a box or suitcase to her car. Harvey checked every item against the list I'd made of my belongings, and twice he stopped Chloe from taking things that were mine, including a set of kitchen knives I'd gotten as a wedding gift and a blanket my grandmother made. Chloe tried to argue that Ryan had given her those things, but Harvey pulled out receipts and photos proving they were mine from before she ever moved in. By the end of the second day, Chloe's car was packed and she stood in the doorway glaring at me. She told Ryan he was making the biggest mistake of his life, and when he came to his senses, she might not take him back. Then she left, and I watched her car disappear down the street. Ryan stood at the window for a long time after she drove away, and then he went upstairs without saying anything. I heard him moving around in the guest bedroom and realized he was moving his stuff out of the master bedroom they'd shared. Over the next week, I barely saw him even though we were living in the same house. He'd come downstairs at odd hours to grab food from the kitchen, then go back to his room. The few times I did see him, he looked terrible with dark circles under his eyes, and he'd clearly lost weight. I could hear him pacing in his room at night, and sometimes I'd hear him on the phone having quiet conversations that I assumed were with Chloe. One morning I knocked on his door and told him we needed to talk. He let me in, and I sat on the edge of his bed while he stood by the window. I told him about Pamela, who specialized in helping people understand manipulation and psychological abuse. He said he didn't need therapy and he could figure this out on his own. I pulled out my phone and showed him an article about something called gaslighting, and how people who experience it often can't see it clearly without professional help. He read the article, and I watched his face change as he recognized pattern after pattern from his relationship with Chloe. He asked me how I found this therapist, and I admitted I'd been seeing her myself for the past 4 months while I was gathering evidence. I told him that understanding how Chloe manipulated him was the only way to make sure it never happened again with anyone else. He was quiet for a long time, and then he asked me to text him Pamela's number. My sister Valeria called me that afternoon like she had every single day since the confrontation. She asked if I wanted her to come stay for a while because she was worried about me being in the house with all these memories of what Chloe had done. I told her I actually felt stronger now than I had in 3 years, because I didn't have to pretend everything was normal anymore. She said she understood, but made me promise to call her if I needed anything at all. The storage facility manager called me the next day and said he had all the rental records ready for me. I drove over there and he handed me a folder showing Chloe had been renting the unit for 26 months and had made over 40 visits during that time. He unlocked the unit, and I stood there staring at boxes and bags and furniture that I'd thought were lost or misplaced. My grandmother's jewelry box was sitting on top of a stack of photo albums. My father's watch collection was in a plastic container next to a box of my important legal documents. There were paintings I'd inherited from my aunt and china sets I'd been given as gifts and clothes I thought I'd accidentally donated. I spent 3 hours going through everything and loading it into my car, and I was shocked by how much she'd managed to steal over the years. Some of the items I hadn't even realized were missing because Chloe had taken them so gradually. The next morning, my neighbor Natalia knocked on my door holding a plate of cookies. She came in and sat at my kitchen table and admitted she'd witnessed several things over the past few years that seemed off, but she hadn't wanted to interfere in family business. She told me about a time she saw Chloe moving my car keys from the hook by the door to under the couch cushions. She described another incident where she heard Chloe on her phone in the backyard talking about how much longer it would take to get me declared incompetent. Natalia offered to write down everything she'd seen and heard in a formal statement, and I accepted immediately. Harvey called me that afternoon and said he was filing for a restraining order on my behalf. He'd compiled all the evidence of medication tampering and the 3-year pattern of psychological abuse, and he was confident the judge would grant it. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks out, and Harvey told me to prepare myself, because Chloe would probably show up with her own lawyer trying to make me look like the villain. Ryan came home from his first therapy session with Pamela looking completely drained like he'd run a marathon. He sat down at the kitchen table and told me Pamela had helped him see how Chloe used something called gaslighting to make him doubt his own memory and perception of reality. He said she'd explained how abusers isolate their victims by turning them against the people who actually care about them. He looked at me with tears in his eyes and said he finally understood how Chloe had used his love for me as a weapon to hurt both of us. The next morning, Ryan showed me his phone, and there were already 17 text messages from Chloe that had come in overnight. The first few were apologies saying she was sorry for everything and just wanted to talk things through like adults. Then they shifted to accusations that I had poisoned his mind against her, and he was choosing his manipulative mother over his wife. She sent photos of their apartment hunting together, claiming he was throwing away their future. She texted that his family never gave her a fair chance and I had been plotting against her from day one. Ryan looked exhausted scrolling through them and said they had been coming in every hour since he left his last therapy session. I told him to forward everything to Harvey for the restraining order case, and he nodded while saving each message to a folder. His phone buzzed again with another text from Chloe saying she knew he still loved her and begging him to meet her somewhere private to talk. Pamela had warned him during their session that Chloe would likely escalate her contact attempts now that she was losing control of the situation. She advised him to stop responding completely and document every single message because the pattern of harassment would strengthen our case at the hearing. Ryan turned off his phone notifications and put it face down on the table. My brother Dylan called later that afternoon, and I could hear the guilt in his voice before he even started talking. He said he felt terrible about believing Chloe's presentation at the family meeting and not questioning any of her claims more carefully. He kept saying he should have known something was wrong when she had all those staged photos and convenient documentation ready to go. I told him Chloe was skilled at manipulation and had been building her case for 3 years, so nobody should feel bad about being fooled by her performance. Dylan asked what he could do now to help, and said he would do anything to make up for doubting me. I thought about it for a minute, then asked if he would write down everything he remembered from that family meeting. I needed a detailed statement about Chloe's presentation, and especially her reaction when I confronted her with evidence. Dylan agreed immediately and said he would send me something within a couple days. He remembered specific things Chloe had said during her presentation about my supposed cognitive decline, and how she had cried when talking about the burden of caring for me. He also recalled how quickly her tears turned to rage when I pulled out my folder of evidence, and how she had screamed at Ryan to defend her. 2 days later, Dylan emailed me a 4-page statement that covered everything from the family meeting. He described how Chloe had arrived early to set up her presentation with printed materials, and seemed almost excited to be sharing her concerns about my health. He wrote about specific incidents she had claimed, including times I supposedly forgot conversations, or got confused about basic tasks. He noted that several family members had seemed skeptical during her presentation, but nobody wanted to question her directly because she positioned herself as the concerned caretaker. The most valuable part was his description of what happened after I revealed my evidence. He wrote that Chloe's face had gone from sympathetic concern to pure fury in seconds, and she had lunged at my documentation trying to grab it away. He described how she screamed that I was lying and fabricating everything, while Ryan sat frozen looking at the security camera footage. Dylan also included his observation that Chloe never actually denied any of the specific evidence I presented, but instead attacked my character and motives. I forwarded his statement to Harvey, who said it was exactly the kind of third-party corroboration that would be powerful at the restraining order hearing. The police detective assigned to my case called the next morning and introduced himself before explaining they were investigating potential criminal charges against Chloe. He said based on the initial report and evidence the officers had seen, they were looking at charges for theft, elder abuse, and fraud. He needed me to come down to the station to give a formal statement and bring all my documentation, including the security footage, medical records, and toxicology reports. I scheduled an appointment for that afternoon and spent an hour organizing everything into clearly labeled folders. Ryan offered to come with me for support, but I told him to stay home and rest because he looked like he had barely slept in days. I drove to the police station with 2 boxes full of evidence and met with the detective in a small interview room. He was probably in his mid-40s with gray hair and a serious expression that made me feel like he was taking this case seriously. I spent 3 hours going through everything with the detective, and he took detailed notes while reviewing each piece of evidence. He watched the security camera footage multiple times and kept pausing on the clips showing Chloe tampering with my medication. He said that particular evidence was extremely concerning, because medication tampering could result in serious criminal charges, since it had directly endangered my health. I showed him the toxicology report proving I had been drugged, and explained how I had started feeling foggy and confused before I realized what was happening. The detective asked specific questions about when I first suspected something was wrong, and how I had gone about documenting Chloe's behavior without tipping her off. He seemed impressed that I had been strategic about gathering evidence and said most victims of this type of abuse never think to protect themselves that way. He reviewed the storage unit records and receipts showing Chloe had been systematically stealing my belongings for over 2 years. He photographed every document and made copies of the security footage to add to the case file. Before I left, he told me the district attorney would review everything and decide on formal charges within the next few weeks. Ryan's Aunt Charlotte called that evening to check on both of us, and I could hear the relief in her voice when I answered. She said she had been worried sick since hearing about everything that happened at the family meeting. Charlotte was Ethan's mother, so she had always known about the trust arrangement and why the house was set up that way. She told me she was grateful that Chloe's scheme could never have actually succeeded in taking the house, even if she had managed to get me declared incompetent. I explained that knowing the house was protected had given me courage to confront Chloe instead of just accepting the abuse. Charlotte asked how Ryan was handling everything, and I told her honestly that he was struggling with guilt and confusion about his role in what happened. She asked if she could talk to Ryan directly and help him understand the family's perspective on the situation. I handed the phone to Ryan and he took it into his room for privacy. Charlotte spent over an hour talking to Ryan and helping him work through his feelings about protecting me versus betraying his marriage. I could hear his voice through the door getting emotional at times, but also sounding more steady as the conversation went on. When he came out later, he told me Charlotte had helped him see that Chloe's actions were calculated abuse and not misguided concern, like he had been trying to tell himself. She reminded him that real concern for someone's well-being doesn't involve hiding their medication or stealing their belongings or lying to their family. She told him that protecting his mother from abuse was not a betrayal of his marriage, but rather the right thing to do when his wife turned out to be an abuser. Ryan said Charlotte also pointed out that Chloe had manipulated him just as much as she manipulated me, and he needed to stop blaming himself for not seeing through her lies sooner. He looked lighter somehow after that conversation, like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The restraining order hearing arrived 3 weeks after Harvey filed the paperwork, and I dressed carefully that morning, wanting to look put together and competent. Ryan drove us to the courthouse, and we met Harvey in the lobby where he reviewed what to expect during the hearing. He said the judge would hear from both sides and review the evidence before deciding whether to grant the temporary order. We walked into the courtroom, and I saw Chloe sitting at the opposite table with her own attorney. She had dressed in a conservative navy suit with her hair pulled back and minimal makeup, trying to look like a responsible, concerned family member. Her attorney was a woman in her 50s who kept glancing at our table with a calculating expression. When the judge entered, everyone stood, and I felt my heart beating faster, knowing this was the moment where everything would be decided. Harvey stood and presented our evidence in a calm, methodical way that made every piece seem even more damning. He showed the security footage of Chloe hiding my medication, and the judge's expression grew increasingly stern as she watched. He presented the toxicology reports and medical records proving I had been drugged and was in perfect health despite Chloe's claims. He showed the storage unit records and photos of my stolen belongings. He played the recording of Chloe telling her sister the house would be theirs once I was declared incompetent. Chloe's attorney tried to interrupt several times, claiming the security footage was taken out of context and didn't show the full picture of Chloe's concern for my well-being. She argued that Chloe had only been trying to help, and any mistakes were made with good intentions. But when Harvey played the video of Chloe deliberately tampering with my blood pressure medication, the courtroom went completely silent. Even Chloe's attorney seemed to realize there was no way to spin that footage as anything other than what it was. The judge reviewed the evidence for several minutes before announcing her decision. She said the medication tampering alone was sufficient grounds for a restraining order because it demonstrated a clear danger to my health and safety. She granted a temporary restraining order requiring Chloe to stay at least 500 feet away from me, my home, and my workplace. The order would remain in effect pending a full hearing in 30 days where it could be extended or made permanent. Chloe's face went bright red with anger, and she started to stand up, but her attorney grabbed her arm and whispered urgently in her ear. The judge warned Chloe that any violation of the restraining order would result in immediate arrest and criminal charges. She also noted that the evidence suggested possible criminal behavior that should be investigated by law enforcement. Harvey thanked the judge, and we gathered our materials to leave while Chloe sat rigid in her chair, staring straight ahead with her jaw clenched tight. We walked toward the parking lot, and I felt relieved that the judge had taken everything seriously. Harvey was reviewing the restraining order paperwork with me when I heard shouting behind us. Chloe had broken away from her attorney and was running across the parking lot toward Ryan. Her attorney called after her, but Chloe ignored her completely. She grabbed Ryan's arm and started begging him to come home with her. She said I had destroyed their marriage with lies and manipulation. She said everything she did was because she loved him and wanted to protect their future together. Ryan pulled his arm away and told her he saw the truth with his own eyes. He said watching the video of her tampering with my medication made him sick. Chloe's face twisted with anger, and she started yelling that I had poisoned him against her. Her attorney finally caught up and physically pulled her away while apologizing to us. Harvey made a note of the violation since Chloe had approached Ryan despite the fresh restraining order. That evening, Ryan came to me with a folder of papers. He said he had called a lawyer that afternoon and filed for legal separation. He explained he wasn't ready for divorce yet, but needed space to process everything without Chloe's influence. He asked if he could stay in the house while he figured things out. I told him of course he could stay as long as he needed. He moved his remaining belongings to the guest bedroom down the hall from mine. The next morning, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. A woman introduced herself as someone from the district attorney's office. She said they had reviewed the police report and all my evidence. She explained they were recommending criminal charges against Chloe for theft, elder abuse, fraud, and assault. She said the medication tampering qualified as poisoning under state law. She asked if I would be willing to press charges and testify if needed. I told her yes without hesitation. She scheduled a meeting for me to come in and give a formal statement. 3 days later, I sat in the prosecutor's office going through everything again. The prosecutor was a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes who took detailed notes. She told me elder abuse cases were taken very seriously in our state. She said my documentation and evidence made this one of the strongest cases she had ever seen. She explained that Chloe could face significant prison time if convicted on all counts. She asked me to walk her through specific incidents, and I spent 2 hours detailing 3 years of manipulation. The prosecutor said she was confident about getting a conviction. A week later, Harvey called to say Chloe's attorney had contacted him about a plea deal. Chloe wanted to avoid trial and was willing to plead guilty to reduce charges. In exchange, she wanted probation instead of prison time and would pay back the value of the stolen items. Harvey said the decision was completely mine, but he wanted me to think carefully about it. I told Ryan about the plea offer that night over dinner. He pushed his food around his plate and said the decision was mine to make. Then he looked up and said he thought I should push for full accountability. He explained that his therapist, Pamela, had been helping him understand how abusers operate. He said accepting minimal consequences just allows them to hurt other people later. He said Chloe needed to face real consequences for what she did. I thought about it overnight and called the prosecutor the next morning. I told her I was rejecting the plea deal and wanted to proceed to trial. I explained that Chloe spent 3 years systematically abusing me, and other people needed to see that this behavior had serious results. The prosecutor said she respected my decision and would prepare for trial. Over the next few weeks, Ryan continued his therapy sessions with Pamela. He came home from each appointment looking tired but also more clear-headed. One evening, he told me Pamela had helped him see warning signs he completely missed. He said Chloe used something called isolation tactics to cut him off from family and friends. She made him think everyone else was the problem, so he would only trust her version of reality. He said he felt stupid for not seeing it sooner, but Pamela reminded him that manipulation works because it's designed to be invisible. My nephew Ethan called one afternoon to thank me for protecting the family home. He said his mom Charlotte had told him everything that happened. He said he had no idea any of this was going on, but he was grateful I was strong enough to fight back. He told me he always loved that house and appreciated that it would stay in the family. I told him he was a good kid, and I knew he would take care of it someday. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks after the restraining order. Ryan and I arrived at the courthouse and met Harvey in the lobby again. Chloe sat at the other table with her attorney looking angry and scared at the same time. Her attorney stood and argued that the charges should be dismissed because the evidence was circumstantial. She claimed the security footage could be interpreted different ways. She said the medication incident was a misunderstanding, and Chloe had simply moved the pills for safety reasons. The prosecutor stood and methodically presented each piece of evidence. She showed the footage of Chloe deliberately hiding my medication. She presented the toxicology reports proving I had been drugged. She showed the storage unit records and photos of stolen property. She played the recording of Chloe telling her sister the house would be theirs once I was declared incompetent. The judge reviewed everything carefully and asked Chloe's attorney several pointed questions. The attorney struggled to explain away the recording and the medication tampering. After 20 minutes, the judge announced her ruling. She said there was more than enough evidence to proceed to trial on all counts. She noted that the medication tampering alone constituted a serious crime that endangered my health. Chloe's face went red and she whispered urgently to her attorney. The judge set a trial date for 3 months out and reminded Chloe that any violation of the restraining order would result in immediate arrest. We left the courthouse and I felt ready for whatever came next. 2 days later, Harvey called to tell me that Chloe's parents wanted to meet and discuss a settlement. They came to his office that afternoon and I sat across from them while they apologized for their daughter's behavior. Chloe's father said they were willing to pay full restitution for everything stolen, plus an additional $50,000 if I would agree to reduce charges. Her mother cried and said they never raised Chloe to be this way, and they were horrified by what she did. Harvey looked at me waiting for my response, and I told them this was never about money. I explained that Chloe spent 3 years hurting me in ways that went beyond stolen property, and other people needed to see that actions like hers had real consequences. Chloe's father tried to argue that a trial would destroy their daughter's future, but I reminded him that Chloe tried to destroy my present by putting me in a nursing home and stealing my house. Her mother asked what they could do to make this right, and I told her the only thing that would make it right was Chloe facing what she did in court. They left looking defeated, and Harvey said he respected my decision, even though settling would have been easier. The next week, Ryan came home from therapy and asked if we could talk. He sat down at the kitchen table and told me he decided to file for divorce. I asked if he was sure, and he said Pamela helped him understand that Chloe's behavior showed a basic character problem that went way beyond making mistakes. He explained that someone who could spend 3 years planning to have me declared crazy and locked away was not someone he could ever trust again. Ryan said he kept trying to find excuses for her actions, but therapy made him see that what Chloe did required constant, deliberate choices to hurt me. He filed the papers the next day and had them served to Chloe at her parents' house. 3 weeks after the preliminary hearing, Harvey called to say the trial date was set for 3 months out. He asked me to come to his office so we could start preparing for my testimony. I spent 2 hours going through every piece of evidence, and Harvey warned me that Chloe's attorney would try to make me look like a mean mother-in-law who never accepted her son's wife. He said our evidence was strong enough to overcome any character attacks, but I needed to stay calm and stick to facts when answering questions. Harvey had me practice responding to hostile questions and taught me to pause before answering so I wouldn't get flustered. Over the next few weeks, I started reaching out to friends I had been avoiding during the worst of Chloe's manipulation. My friend Janet came over for coffee and told me she noticed I seemed stressed and distant for the past year. She said she wanted to help but didn't know what was wrong and thought maybe I was dealing with health problems. Another friend, Maria, said she remembered times when Chloe would make comments about my memory that seemed mean, but she figured it was just daughter-in-law tension. Several friends offered to testify as character witnesses if Harvey needed them, and I felt grateful to have people who believed me. 2 months after moving back home, Ryan told me he found his own apartment. He said living with me was comfortable, but he needed space to process everything and figure out who he was, separate from Chloe's manipulation and his guilt about what happened. I understood and helped him move his things the following weekend. His apartment was small but clean, and he seemed relieved to have his own place. Ryan still came over for dinner once a week, and our relationship felt stronger now that we were both being honest about everything. Around this same time, Natalia and several other neighbors came forward with statements about suspicious things they witnessed. Natalia told Harvey she saw Chloe carrying boxes to her car at odd hours multiple times over the past 2 years. Another neighbor said she overheard Chloe on her cell phone in the driveway talking about strategies to convince Ryan I was losing my mind. A third neighbor reported seeing Chloe taking photos of my house when I wasn't home, and wondered at the time why she was doing that. Harvey collected all these statements and said they would help establish a pattern of calculated behavior. The private investigator Sean Tanner, who I hired 6 months ago, finally provided his complete report. He documented 19 visits Chloe made to different memory care facilities over 18 months. He had records of 3 consultations she had with attorneys about guardianship procedures before she ever talked to Ryan about it. Sean found her search history showing research into elder incompetency laws and how to get someone declared unable to manage their own affairs. He even had photos of Chloe meeting with a realtor to discuss selling my house 6 months before the family meeting. Harvey said this report proved everything was planned and deliberate rather than spontaneous concern. 2 weeks before the trial was supposed to start, Chloe's attorney contacted Harvey with a new plea offer. She said Chloe would plead guilty to all charges in exchange for the prosecutor recommending probation, instead of jail time plus restitution and mandatory counseling. Harvey called me to discuss it, and I asked what he thought I should do. He said plea deals guaranteed a conviction without the stress and uncertainty of a trial. The prosecutor called me directly that afternoon and said she recommended accepting the plea because it ensured Chloe would have a permanent criminal record and court-ordered consequences. I talked to Ryan about it that evening, and he said the decision was mine, but he thought a guilty plea meant Chloe had to admit what she did publicly. After thinking about it for 2 days, I called Harvey and told him I would accept the plea agreement. The plea hearing was scheduled for the following week, and I arrived at the courthouse with Ryan and Harvey. Chloe stood before the judge with her attorney and had to allocate to each charge one by one. She admitted to stealing my belongings and hiding them in a storage unit. She admitted to tampering with my medication and putting it in her room. She admitted to staging incidents to make me look confused and incompetent. She admitted to planning to have me declared unable to care for myself, so she could take my house. Her voice shook as she spoke, and she never looked at me or Ryan. The judge asked if she understood she was giving up her right to trial, and Chloe said yes. Watching her stand there and confess to 3 years of hurting me on purpose gave me a feeling I didn't expect. It wasn't happiness exactly, but something like my body finally believing that people knew the truth, and Chloe couldn't lie her way out of what she did anymore. The judge looked at Chloe and said the court accepted her guilty plea and would now proceed to sentencing. He reviewed the pre-sentencing report and the prosecutor's recommendation for 3 years probation. The judge said this was a serious case of elder abuse involving calculated manipulation over an extended period. He sentenced Chloe to 3 years supervised probation with 500 hours of community service to be completed at a senior center where she would see firsthand the people she tried to victimize. She had to attend mandatory therapy twice a month and provide progress reports to her probation officer. The judge ordered full restitution for all stolen items, plus my legal fees and medical testing costs, which totaled over $30,000. He also imposed a no-contact order prohibiting Chloe from coming within 500 feet of me or Ryan for the duration of her probation. Chloe's face went white when she heard the amount she owed, and her attorney had to steady her arm. The judge asked if she understood the terms, and she nodded without speaking. Ryan and I left the courthouse together, and he seemed relieved it was finally over. 2 months after the sentencing, Ryan's divorce was finalized. He came to my house with the papers, and we sat in the kitchen while he told me about the final hearing. Chloe didn't contest anything, and her attorney worked out a settlement where they split their shared assets and went their separate ways. Ryan said his therapist Pamela helped him understand he was a victim too, but he still struggled with guilt about not protecting me sooner. He kept apologizing for believing Chloe's lies, and I reminded him that manipulation works by making you doubt your own perceptions. He told me therapy showed him all the ways Chloe isolated him from family and made him dependent on her version of reality. I could see he was working through it, but the guilt was still there in how he looked at me. Around the same time, I started my own therapy sessions with Pamela to process 3 years of psychological abuse. She was the one who helped Ryan and came highly recommended for dealing with family manipulation cases. In our first session, I told her everything, and she listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said my response was actually brilliant because I recognized the abuse early, documented everything systematically, and protected myself strategically instead of just reacting emotionally. She helped me understand that gaslighting works by making you question your own reality and memory. Chloe's constant suggestions that I was declining were designed to make me doubt myself, but I trusted my own perceptions enough to investigate. Pamela said that kind of self-awareness and strategic thinking probably saved me from years of legal battles or worse. We worked on processing the anger and betrayal I felt about Ryan's role, even though I understood he was manipulated too. 6 months after the confrontation, Ryan and I started having dinner together every Sunday at my house. And our relationship was stronger than it had been in years because we could finally talk honestly about what happened. He told me about the new woman he was dating named Claire who worked at his office. She treated him with genuine respect and didn't try to control or manipulate him. I met her twice, and she seemed kind and straightforward in a way that made me hopeful for Ryan. My house felt like mine again without the constant tension of Chloe's presence. I rearranged furniture and put my belongings back where they belonged after retrieving everything from the storage unit. The cameras came down and I changed all the locks. I learned that protecting yourself isn't selfish or mean. It's necessary for survival and healing when someone is trying to destroy you.